Welcome to another exploration into the darker corners of American history, stories that remain as mysterious as they are unsettling. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. It's always intriguing to see how far these accounts travel and when they find their audience. With that said, let's journey back into the past. In the heart of Missouri's Ozark Mountains, where morning mist clings to ancient hills like ghostly fingers, stands a courthouse that has witnessed more than a century of secrets. The year was 1914, and in the small town of Stoneville, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, something sinister was about to surface from the depths of what appeared to be an ordinary county building. The Stoneville County Courthouse rose from the town square like a monument to justice and order. Its red brick facade and towering clock tower spoke of permanence, of a community built on solid foundations. But beneath its respectable exterior, in the shadowy basement where few dared to venture, lay secrets that would challenge everything the townspeople believed about their quiet corner of Missouri. Clifton Avery had worked as a county clerk for nearly 8 years, and in all that time he had never paid much attention to the basement. It was simply where old files were stored, where forgotten records gathered dust in neat rows of wooden cabinets. The basement was cool and quiet, a perfect refuge from the summer heat that made the upper floors of the courthouse feel like an oven. But lately, something had changed. It started with the shadows. Avery first noticed them on a Tuesday morning in late September, when the autumn light filtered through the basement's small, grimy windows at just the right angle. Shadows that seemed to move independently of their sour, dark shapes that darted across the walls when no one was there to cast them. At first, he dismissed it as tricks of the light, the natural play of sunshine and dust motes in an old building. Then came the sounds. Soft at first, barely audible above the settling groans of the aging structure. A whisper of movement, like fabric brushing against stone. The gentle tap, tap, tap of footsteps, where no feet should be walking. Avery would pause in his work, listening intently, but the sounds would cease the moment he focused on them, leaving only the tick of his pocket watch and the distant murmur of voices from the floors above. The missing documents were what finally convinced him that something was genuinely wrong. Files that should have been in their designated places simply weren't there. Court records from recent cases, property deeds, even birth certificates, all vanishing without explanation. When Avery brought these discrepancies to his supervisor, Harold Wickham, the older man simply shrugged and suggested that perhaps Avery was looking in the wrong places. But Avery knew his filing system better than anyone. He had organized those basement archives himself, creating a methodical system that made every document easy to locate. Papers didn't simply walk away on their own, yet that seemed to be exactly what was happening. The townspeople of Stoneville had their own theories about the courthouse basement. Old Martha Henderson, who ran the general store and seemed to know every piece of gossip within 50 miles, claimed she had heard strange noises emanating from the building during the late hours of the night. Her nephew, who delivered groceries past the courthouse each evening, swore he had seen flickering lights in the basement windows long after all the clerks and officials had gone home. "That building's got a mind of its own," Martha would tell anyone willing to listen. "Always has, ever since they built it back in '78. Strange things happen in old places, mark my words." Missouri in 1914 was a state caught between the old ways and the new century. The Ozark region, in particular, remained largely rural and isolated, its communities bound together by tradition, superstition, and the unforgiving landscape that had shaped their ancestors' lives for generations. Towns like Stoneville, West Plains, and the larger Springfield to the north existed in a world where modern conveniences were slowly making their way into daily life, but where old beliefs died hard. The Missouri Ozarks had always been a place where stories lived long in the memory. Tales of hidden caves filled with Confederate gold, of mysterious disappearances in the deep forests, of families who had lived in isolation for so long they had developed their own peculiar customs. It was a landscape that bred legends, and the people who called it home understood that some things simply couldn't be explained by modern reasoning. Law enforcement in these rural counties was often a matter of personal relationships and local politics rather than standardized procedure. County sheriffs wielded considerable power, and corruption was not uncommon. The state capital in Jefferson City might as well have been on the other side of the world for all the influence it had on day-to-day governance in places like Stoneville. Justice was often decided by whoever held the most sway in the community, and secrets could be buried as easily as bodies in the rocky Ozark soil. It was against this backdrop of isolation, superstition, and questionable authority that Clifton Avery began to notice the strange occurrences in the courthouse basement. In a place where unexplained events were often attributed to supernatural causes, where the boundary between the natural and the otherworldly was thin and permeable, his discoveries would soon take on a significance that went far beyond simple administrative confusion. The people of Stoneville had learned to live with uncertainty, to accept that some questions had no comfortable answers, but they were about to learn that some secrets, once unearthed, demand a reckoning that no amount of willful ignorance can prevent. On the morning of October 15, 1914, Clifton Avery descended into the courthouse basement with a kerosene lamp in one hand and a growing sense of unease in his chest. The electric lighting that had been installed throughout the upper floors of the building had never been extended to the basement, leaving the lower level dependent on oil lamps and whatever natural light could struggle through the narrow windows. The basement felt different that morning. The air seemed thicker, almost oppressive, carrying with it a musty scent that reminded Avery of old graves. As he moved between the rows of filing cabinets, the lamp's flickering light cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating the illusion of movement in his peripheral vision. He was searching for a property deed that should have been filed under Morrison when he heard it clearly for the first time, a sound that made his blood run cold. It was the distinct clank of metal against metal, echoing from somewhere deeper in the basement, followed by what could only be described as muffled whispers. Human voices, speaking in tones too low to understand, but unmistakably present. Avery froze, listening intently. The sounds continued for several seconds before fading into silence. He called out, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Hello? Is someone down here?" No response came, but as he stood there in the lamp's wavering circle of light, he noticed something he had never seen before. Along the far wall of the basement, partially hidden behind a tall stack of wooden crates, was what appeared to be a section of wall that didn't quite match the rest. The mortar was a slightly different color, and the bricks seemed newer, as if they had been added long after the original construction. With growing curiosity overcoming his apprehension, Avery made his way toward the suspicious wall section. As he drew closer, he realized that what he had taken for solid masonry was actually a cleverly constructed false wall. The newer bricks were held in place by nothing more than wooden braces, and behind them he could see the darkness of an opening. The whispers came again, clearer now, seeming to emanate from the hidden space beyond the false wall. Avery's hands trembled as he set down the lamp and began to carefully remove the wooden braces. The bricks came away easily, revealing a narrow passage that led deeper into the building's foundations. Cool air flowed from the passage, carrying with it scents that Avery couldn't identify. something organic and unpleasant, mixed with the dry mustiness of very old paper. He picked up his lamp and peered into the darkness beyond the opening. The passage extended for perhaps 20 feet before opening into what appeared to be a larger chamber. Against every instinct that told him to turn back, to replace the bricks, and pretend he had never found the hidden passage, Avery squeezed through the opening and began to make his way toward the chamber beyond. The walls of the passage were carved from the native limestone that lay beneath much of the Ozark region, and they gleamed wetly in the lamplight as if they were sweating. The chamber he entered took his breath away. It was much larger than he had expected, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadows above the reach of his lamp. But it was what the chamber contained that made Avery's knees weak with shock and disbelief. Along the walls stood row upon row of wooden shelves, and upon those shelves were hundreds of files, documents, books, and objects that clearly had no business being in a courthouse basement. Some of the papers appeared ancient, their edges brown and crumbling with age. Others looked more recent, but bore no resemblance to any official county documents Avery had ever seen. As he moved deeper into the chamber, the lamp's light revealed items that made his pulse quicken with alarm. There were leather-bound journals filled with handwriting in various scripts and languages, maps that showed the local area but marked with symbols and notations that made no sense. Strange artifacts that seemed to be carved from bone or stone, their purposes unknown, but their appearance deeply unsettling. But it was the personal items that truly frightened him. Scattered among the documents were objects that clearly belonged to individuals. A child's doll, its face stained with something dark. A woman's jewelry, tarnished and broken. Men's pocket watches, their hands stopped at various times. These were not the belongings of people who had willingly parted with them. Avery picked up one of the journals with shaking hands and opened it to a random page. The writing was in English, but the content made little sense to him. It appeared to be some kind of record, documenting names, dates, and locations, but the context was obscure and troubling. References to subjects, procedures, and disposals filled the pages, written in a clinical hand that suggested the author had been recording events with methodical precision. As he read, the whispers began again, and this time they seemed to be coming from all around him. Avery spun around, holding the lamp high, but the chamber appeared empty except for its disturbing contents. Yet the voices continued, soft and insistent, speaking words he couldn't quite make out, but that filled him with a dread he couldn't shake. He had to get out. Whatever this place was, whatever secrets it held, they were not meant for him to discover. Avery quickly made his way back through the passage, his lamp flickering wildly as he hurried. Once back in the familiar basement, he hastily replaced the wooden braces and stacked the crates back in front of the false wall, trying to make everything appear exactly as it had before. But even as he climbed the stairs back to the main floor of the courthouse, Avery knew that his life had been irrevocably changed by what he had seen. The questions that filled his mind demanded answers, even as his instincts warned him that some knowledge was too dangerous to pursue. The normal sounds of the courthouse, the shuffle of papers, the murmur of conversations, the tick of clocks, now seemed hollow and false to his ears. How many of his colleagues knew about the hidden chamber? How long had those documents and artifacts been gathering in the darkness beneath their feet? And most disturbing of all, what had become of the people to whom those personal belongings had once belonged? Word of Avery's discovery spread through Stoneville with the inexorable speed of water seeping through limestone. Despite his attempts to keep quiet about what he had found, the clerk found it impossible to maintain his normal routine. His distraction was obvious to his colleagues, and his frequent nervous glances toward the basement stairs did not go unnoticed. Harold Wickham was the first to confront him directly. The supervisor cornered Avery in the filing room 3 days after the discovery, his usually genial expression replaced by something harder and more calculating. "You've been acting strange, Clifton," Wickham said, closing the door behind him. "People are starting to talk. What's got into you?" Avery tried to deflect, claiming he had been feeling unwell, but Wickham's penetrating stare suggested he wasn't buying the explanation. The older man had worked in the courthouse for over 20 years, and little happened within its walls that escaped his notice. "You haven't been spending time in the basement lately, have you?" Wickham asked, and there was something in his tone that made Avery's blood run cold. It wasn't curiosity in the supervisor's voice, it was warning. "Just doing my regular filing," Avery replied, but he could hear the tremor in his own voice. Wickham studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "Some parts of this building are better left alone, Clifton. Old buildings have old problems, and sometimes it's best to let sleeping dogs lie. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" The message was clear, but it only served to confirm Avery's suspicions that others knew about the hidden chamber and its contents. How many people were involved in whatever conspiracy had created that underground repository of secrets? Sheriff Thomas Briggs was the next to take an interest in Avery's behavior. Briggs was a large man with a reputation for solving problems through intimidation rather than investigation. He had held the sheriff's position for nearly a decade, and rumors of his involvement in various questionable activities had followed him throughout his tenure. When he appeared at Avery's desk on a Friday afternoon, his presence immediately attracted the attention of everyone in the office. "Heard you've been asking a lot of questions lately," Briggs said, leaning heavily on Avery's desk. "Questions about missing files, about sounds in the basement. That's the kind of curiosity that can get a man into trouble around here." Avery felt the weight of every eye in the office upon him. His colleagues had stopped their work to watch the exchange, and he could see the mixture of fear and fascination in their expressions. It was clear that this was not the first time Sheriff Briggs had made such visits to discourage unwanted curiosity. "I'm just trying to do my job, Sheriff," Avery replied, attempting to keep his voice steady. "Your job is to file papers and keep records," Briggs said, his voice carrying clearly across the office. "Your job is not to go exploring in places you don't belong, asking questions about things that don't concern you. I hope that's clear." The threat was unmistakable, but it also confirmed what Avery had begun to suspect, that the hidden chamber was known to the authorities, and that its existence was being actively protected. The question was why, and what they were so desperate to keep secret. That evening, as Avery walked home through Stoneville's quiet streets, he found himself looking at his familiar town with new eyes. The comfortable routine of small-town life now seemed like a carefully constructed facade, hiding darker truths beneath its placid surface. How many of his neighbors knew about the secrets buried beneath the courthouse? How many were involved in maintaining the conspiracy of silence? The historical context of Missouri in 1914 provided a framework for understanding how such secrets could be maintained. During this period, county officials wielded enormous power with little oversight from state or federal authorities. A corrupt sheriff, a compliant judge, and a handful of influential citizens could effectively control all aspects of local governance. The isolation of rural communities made it easy to suppress information and eliminate inconvenient witnesses. Records from this era show that Missouri county governments were frequently involved in various forms of corruption, from simple graft and embezzlement to more serious crimes including murder and conspiracy. The state's history included numerous examples of powerful families or secret organizations that had manipulated local politics for decades, using their influence to protect their interests and silence their enemies. In towns like Stoneville, where everyone knew everyone else's business, the social pressure to conform and avoid asking uncomfortable questions was immense. Those who challenged the established order often found themselves ostracized, threatened, or worse. The phrase, What happens in the county stays in the county was more than just local pride. It was a survival strategy. Judge Cornelius Morrison was a figure who commanded both respect and fear throughout the region. He had presided over the county court for over 15 years, and his decisions were rarely questioned or appealed. Morrison came from one of the area's oldest families, with roots that traced back to the earliest European settlements in the Ozarks. His influence extended far beyond the courtroom, touching every aspect of local government and business. It was Morrison who had overseen the construction of the current courthouse building in 1878, personally supervising the architectural plans and construction process. Local records showed that he had insisted on specific modifications to the standard courthouse design, including an expanded basement level and reinforced foundation walls. At the time, these changes had been explained as necessary accommodations for the rocky terrain and the need for additional storage space. But now, with the discovery of the hidden chamber, those modifications took on a more sinister significance. Had Morrison known from the beginning what the basement would be used for? Had the entire building been designed to conceal the dark activities that were taking place beneath the town's seat of justice? As word of Avery's discovery continued to spread, other residents began to come forward with their own strange experiences and half-remembered stories. Emma Patterson, an elderly woman whose family had lived in Stoneville since before the Civil War, approached Avery outside the general store and spoke in whispers about things she had seen decades earlier. "My grandfather used to tell stories about the old courthouse," she said, glancing around nervously. "To make sure they weren't being overheard. He said there were rooms under the building that didn't appear on any plans, places where the county conducted business that couldn't be done in the light of day. I thought they were just stories, but now—" She trailed off, but her meaning was clear. The hidden chamber that Avery had discovered was not a recent addition to the building. It had been there from the beginning, serving its secret purpose for nearly 4 decades. The weight of this revelation pressed down on Avery like a physical burden. He was not dealing with a recent crime or a temporary conspiracy, but with something that had been part of Stoneville's foundation for his entire lifetime. The implications were staggering, and the danger to anyone who tried to expose the truth was becoming increasingly clear. Driven by a combination of curiosity and a growing sense of moral obligation, Avery knew he had to return to the hidden chamber. The documents and artifacts he had glimpsed during his first visit demanded closer examination, even though every instinct warned him against further involvement. The whispers he had heard, the personal belongings of unknown individuals, the clinical records that suggested something far worse than simple corruption. All of it pointed to a truth that needed to be revealed, regardless of the personal cost. On a moonless night in late October, Avery made his way back into the courthouse through a side entrance to which he had kept a key. The building was empty and dark, its familiar rooms transformed into alien landscapes by shadow and silence. Armed with a more reliable oil lamp and a canvas bag to carry whatever evidence he might find, he descended once again into the basement. The false wall had been reinforced since his last visit. Additional wooden braces had been added, and the crates in front of it had been secured with chains. Someone was clearly trying to prevent further access to the hidden chamber, but their efforts only strengthened Avery's resolve to uncover the truth. Working carefully in the lamplight, he removed the new obstacles and squeezed once again through the opening into the limestone passage. The chamber beyond was exactly as he had left it, but now he approached its contents with a more systematic plan. He would document everything he could, taking detailed notes and removing small items that could serve as evidence of whatever crimes had been committed. The journals proved to be the most revealing source of information. Written in various hands over what appeared to be several decades, they contained records of activities that made Avery's blood run cold. The entries described a systematic program of kidnapping, experimentation, and murder that had been carried out under the authority of county officials. The victims, according to the records, were primarily individuals who would not be missed: traveling salesmen, migrant workers, prostitutes, and other social outcasts. They were brought to the hidden chamber beneath the courthouse, where they were subjected to various forms of torture and experimentation before being killed and disposed of in locations throughout the surrounding forest. The purpose of these activities was not entirely clear from the records, but references to scientific advancement, social purification, and genetic improvement suggested that the perpetrators believed they were conducting some form of research. The clinical language used to describe the most horrific acts of violence indicated a level of detachment and rationalization that was perhaps more disturbing than simple sadistic pleasure. Names appeared repeatedly throughout the journals: Judge Morrison, Sheriff Briggs, several prominent local businessmen, and others who held positions of authority in the community. It was clear that the conspiracy involved many of the most powerful and respected citizens of Stoneville, people who had used their positions to conceal their crimes and protect each other from justice. As Avery read through the entries, he began to understand the scope of what he had uncovered. This was not simply a matter of local corruption or even ordinary criminal activity. The record suggested a systematic program of atrocities that had been carried out for decades, claiming dozens if not hundreds of victims, all hidden beneath the respectable facade of small-town governance. The personal belongings scattered throughout the chamber took on new significance in light of the journal entries. Each item represented a human life that had been snuffed out in the darkness beneath the courthouse. The child's doll belonged to a 7-year-old girl who had disappeared while traveling with her family through the area in 1902. The woman's jewelry had been taken from a school teacher who had vanished on her way to take a position in a neighboring county. The pocket watches had belonged to various men who had simply never arrived at their intended destinations. But it was the maps that truly terrified Avery. Detailed drawings of the local area showed not only the locations where bodies had been buried, but also a network of tunnels and passages that connected the courthouse to other buildings in the town. The conspiracy was even larger than he had imagined, with secret chambers and hidden passages throughout Stoneville that allowed the perpetrators to move unseen and conduct their activities without detection. One map in particular caught his attention. It showed a tunnel that led from the courthouse basement to the basement of the town's largest hotel, the Morrison House, named, Avery now realized with horror, after Judge Morrison himself. Another passage connected to the basement of the general store, while a third led to what appeared to be a cabin in the woods outside of town. The implications were staggering. The entire infrastructure of Stoneville had been designed to facilitate and conceal these crimes. The respected institutions of the community, the courthouse, the hotel, even the general store where residents gathered to share news and gossip, were all part of a vast criminal enterprise that had operated in plain sight for decades. As Avery continued to study the documents, he heard the whispers beginning again. But this time, instead of indistinct murmurs, he could make out individual words and phrases, names of victims, pleas for help, descriptions of the horrors they had endured. The voices seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, as if the limestone had absorbed the final words of those who had died in the chamber. The psychological impact of these discoveries was becoming overwhelming. Avery found himself shaking uncontrollably as he tried to process the magnitude of what he had uncovered. Every person he had ever respected in the community, every authority figure he had trusted, every institution he had believed in, all of it was built upon a foundation of murder and depravity that defied comprehension. But even as horror threatened to paralyze him, Avery knew that he had a responsibility to the victims whose belongings surrounded him. Their voices, whether real or imagined, demanded justice. The truth had to be revealed, no matter the personal cost. He selected several of the most incriminating documents and placed them carefully in his canvas bag. The journals contained enough evidence to expose the conspiracy and bring the perpetrators to justice if he could find authorities outside of Stoneville who were not part of the cover-up. The state capital in Jefferson City had investigators who could handle a case of this magnitude, people who were beyond the reach of local corruption. As he prepared to leave the chamber, Avery took one last look around at the evidence of decades of systematic evil. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, as if the victims were urging him to action. He made a silent promise to their memory that their deaths would not remain hidden, that the truth would finally be brought to light. But as he made his way back through the passage to the main basement, Avery heard something that made his heart stop. Footsteps were coming down the stairs from the upper floors of the courthouse. Heavy, deliberate steps that suggested someone was searching for him. He quickly extinguished his lamp and pressed himself against the wall, hoping the darkness would conceal his presence. The footsteps reached the basement floor and began moving between the filing cabinets. A beam of light from a powerful electric torch swept back and forth across the room, searching methodically for any sign of intrusion. Avery held his breath, clutching the canvas bag of evidence against his chest. "I know you're down here, Avery," a voice called out. It was Sheriff Briggs, and his tone carried the casual confidence of a man who was accustomed to getting his way. "You might as well come out. We need to have a conversation." The torch beam continued to sweep the basement, moving inexorably toward Avery's hiding place. He knew that discovery was inevitable, and that when it came, his life would likely be forfeit. The evidence he carried condemned some of the most powerful men in the county, and they would not hesitate to add one more victim to their long list of crimes. But in that moment of terror, Avery made a decision that would echo through the decades to come. Instead of surrendering the evidence and hoping for mercy, he would fight for the truth with whatever strength remained to him. The victims whose voices had called to him from the darkness deserved nothing less than his complete commitment to exposing their killers. The confrontation that followed would become the stuff of local legend, whispered about in hushed tones for generations. What happened in the courthouse basement that night would determine whether the conspiracy that had ruled Stoneville for decades would continue unchallenged, or whether the light of justice would finally penetrate the darkness that had consumed so many innocent lives. The torch beam found Avery crouched behind a filing cabinet, and Sheriff Briggs' voice took on a tone of grim satisfaction. "There you are. I was beginning to think you'd found a way out of the building. Come on out, Clifton. Let's discuss this like civilized men." Avery emerged from his hiding place slowly, the canvas bag clutched tightly in his hands. In the harsh light of Briggs's torch, he could see that the sheriff was not alone. Two other men stood in the shadows behind him, Harold Wickham and Judge Morrison himself. The three most powerful men in Stoneville had come personally to deal with the threat to their secret. "You've been a busy man," Morrison said, his cultured voice carrying easily across the basement. "Exploring places you shouldn't, reading things that weren't meant for your eyes. That's a dangerous hobby in a town like this." "People have a right to know what's been happening here," Avery replied, his voice stronger than he had expected. "The families of those victims deserve justice." Wickham laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Justice? You think what we've been doing is about justice? You have no idea what you've stumbled into, do you?" "I know enough," Avery said. "I know that dozens of innocent people have been murdered in that chamber. I know that you've been covering it up for decades. And I know that it's going to stop." Morrison stepped forward, and in the torchlight his face looked ancient and predatory. "What we've been doing here, serves a higher purpose than your simple mind can comprehend. We've been conducting research that will benefit all of humanity, advancing knowledge that our men would never have the courage to pursue. The few lives that have been lost are a small price to pay for the greater good. You're talking about murder, Avery said. There's no justification for what you've done. Isn't there? Briggs interjected. Every one of those people was worthless to society. Criminals, degenerates, social parasites who contributed nothing to the world. We gave their deaths meaning by using them to advance human understanding. The casual dismissal of human life revealed the depth of the corruption that had infected these men. They had rationalized their crimes to such an extent that they genuinely believed they were performing a public service. The victims were not people to them, but simply raw material for their twisted experiments. What you're describing isn't research, Avery said. It's butchery. It's evil, and it has to be exposed. That's where you're wrong, Morrison replied. It doesn't have to be exposed because no one outside this room will ever learn about it. You see, Clifton, you've made the same mistake that many others have made over the years. You've convinced yourself that you can be a hero, that you can single-handedly bring down something that's much larger and more powerful than you can imagine. The judge's words carried the weight of experience, and Avery realized that he was not the first to discover the truth about the courthouse basement. Others had stumbled upon the conspiracy over the years, and all of them had been silenced before they could expose it. How many others have there been? Avery asked. More than you might think, Wickham answered. County clerks like yourself, visiting investigators, even a federal marshal who got too curious about some missing persons reports. This organization has survived for nearly 40 years because we understand the importance of maintaining security. The implications of Wickham's words hit Avery like a physical blow. The conspiracy was not limited to local officials. It reached into state and federal agencies as well. The network of corruption was so extensive that there might be nowhere he could turn for help, no authority that remained untainted by their influence. You seem to be understanding the situation more clearly now, Morrison observed. Good. That will make this easier for everyone involved. You have two choices, Clifton. You can join us, accept the benefits that come with membership in our organization, and help us continue our important work. Or you can be dealt with in the same manner as all the others who have posed a threat to our mission. The offer of membership revealed something important about the conspiracy's structure. They were not simply a group of local criminals, but a formal organization with rules, hierarchies, and procedures for recruiting new members. The systematic nature of their crimes was matched by an equally systematic approach to maintaining their secrecy. What exactly is your mission? Avery asked, playing for time, while he tried to think of some way to escape with the evidence. Human improvement, Morrison replied. The elimination of inferior genetic stock and the advancement of superior bloodlines. We've been studying the effects of selective breeding, the response of different racial types to various stimuli, the most efficient methods of population control. Our work here in Stoneville is part of a larger movement that will eventually transform American society. The eugenic philosophy that Morrison described was becoming increasingly popular in certain academic and political circles during the early 20th century. The idea that society could be improved through selective breeding and the elimination of undesirable elements had gained respectability among intellectuals who believed that science could solve social problems through biological manipulation. But the application of these theories in the Courthouse basement had gone far beyond academic discussion into the realm of systematic murder. The victims had been chosen not for any crimes they had committed, but simply because they belonged to groups that the conspirators deemed inferior or disposable. You're talking about genocide, Avery said. We're talking about evolution, Briggs corrected. Natural selection guided by human intelligence instead of random chance. What we're doing here will be understood and appreciated by future generations, even if small minds like yours can't grasp its significance." The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made all four men freeze. Footsteps on the stairs leading down to the basement. Someone else was entering the building, someone who was not expected. Morrison gestured for silence and motioned for Briggs to investigate. The sheriff moved quietly toward the stairs, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. The footsteps had stopped, suggesting that whoever had entered the building was being cautious about their approach. For a moment, Avery dared to hope that help had arrived, that someone had discovered his absence and come looking for him. But his hopes were quickly dashed when a familiar voice called down from the top of the stairs. "Sheriff Briggs? Judge Morrison? I've brought the materials you requested." It was Dr. Samuel Harrison, the town's physician, and apparently another member of the conspiracy. Harrison descended the stairs carrying a leather medical bag, and his presence explained much about how the crimes had been carried out with such clinical precision. "Perfect timing, Doctor," Morrison said. "We have a situation that requires your expertise." Harrison looked at Avery with the same detached interest he might have shown toward a laboratory specimen. "I see. Another security breach?" "I'm afraid so," Wickham replied. "Mr. Avery has discovered our research facility and has expressed some rather naive concerns about our methodology." "That's unfortunate," Harrison said, setting down his medical bag and opening it to reveal an array of surgical instruments and glass vials filled with various substances. "But not insurmountable. I assume we'll be adding him to the research program?" The casual discussion of his impending murder galvanized Avery into action. He had been paralyzed by the enormity of what he had discovered, but the immediate threat to his life restored his capacity for decisive action. Without warning, he swung the canvas bag containing the evidence at Briggs's torch, knocking it from the sheriff's hand and plunging the basement into darkness. In the confusion that followed, Avery ran toward what he hoped was the stairway leading to the upper floors. He could hear shouts behind him as the conspirators tried to organize a pursuit, but the darkness that had seemed so threatening moments before now provided him with the cover he needed to escape. He reached the stairs and began climbing as quickly as possible, taking them two at a time in his desperate flight. Behind him, he could hear Briggs cursing as he tried to find his dropped torch, while Morrison's voice called out orders to secure the building and prevent Avery's escape. The main floor of the courthouse was dark and empty, illuminated only by the pale moonlight that filtered through the tall windows. Avery made his way toward the front entrance, but found that it had been locked from the outside. The conspirators had taken precautions to prevent his escape. He tried the side doors and found them similarly secured. Panic began to set in as he realized that he was trapped in the building with four men who were prepared to kill him to protect their secret. The evidence he carried would die with him if he couldn't find a way out, and the victims whose voices had called to him from the hidden chamber would remain unavenged. But as he tooed in the moonlit courthouse lobby, desperately trying to think of an escape route, Avery remembered something from the maps he had studied in the hidden chamber. The building was connected to other structures in the town through a network of tunnels. If he could find the entrance to one of those passages, he might be able to escape and get the evidence to authorities outside of Stoneville. The sound of footsteps on the basement stairs told him that his pursuers were closing in. He had to act quickly or risk being cornered in the lobby. Moving as quietly as possible, he made his way toward the rear of the building, where he remembered seeing a door that led to what he had assumed was a storage closet. The door was unlocked, and behind it was indeed a small room filled with cleaning supplies and maintenance equipment. But at the back of the room, partially hidden behind a stack of buckets and mops, was another door that he had never noticed before. This one was made of heavy oak and secured with an iron lock that looked much older than anything else in the courthouse. Avery searched frantically through his pockets, and found a heavy key ring that included keys to various areas of the courthouse. Most of them were clearly marked, but there were several older keys whose purposes he had never known. Working by feel in the darkness, he tried each of the unmarked keys until one turned in the ancient lock. The door opened onto a narrow stone stairway that led downward into complete darkness. This had to be one of the tunnel entrances shown on the maps, a passage that would allow him to escape the courthouse and emerge somewhere else in the town. Without hesitation, he descended the stone steps, pulling the door closed behind him and locking it to delay his pursuers. The tunnel was carved from the same limestone as the hidden chamber, and it stretched ahead of him for what seemed like miles. The air was stale and cold, carrying strange echoes that suggested the passage was part of a much larger underground network. Avery moved as quickly as he dared in the absolute darkness, one hand trailing along the rough stone wall to guide his progress. Behind him, he could hear the muffled sounds of his pursuers discovering his escape route. The oak door would not hold them for long, and they undoubtedly knew the tunnel system better than he did. His only advantage was the head start he had gained, and he would have to make the most of it. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, but eventually Avery saw a faint glimmer of light ahead. As he drew closer, he realized that he was approaching another stairway leading upward. The light was coming from above, possibly from a basement or cellar connected to one of the buildings in town. He climbed the stone steps and found himself facing another heavy door, this one secured from the inside with a simple wooden bar. He lifted the bar and pushed the door open carefully, peering out into what appeared to be the basement of a private residence. The basement was larger and better furnished than most, with electric lighting and what looked like living quarters built into one corner. Maps and documents covered the walls, and several tables held various pieces of equipment whose purposes Avery could not determine. This was clearly another facility connected to the conspiracy, possibly a meeting place or secondary research location. Footsteps above his head told him that someone was moving around in the house, and he realized that he had not escaped the conspiracy's reach by leaving the courthouse. The tunnel had led him directly into another of their strongholds, and his situation had gone from desperate to hopeless. But as he stood in the basement, clutching the canvas bag of evidence, Avery made a decision that would ultimately prove to be his salvation. Instead of trying to flee further, he would hide the evidence where the conspirators could not find it, creating a permanent record of their crimes that would survive even if he did not. Working quickly and quietly, he found a loose stone in the basement wall and carved out a hiding place large enough to hold the most incriminating documents. He wrapped them carefully in oilcloth to protect them from moisture and sealed them inside the improvised cache. Even if the conspirators captured and killed him, the evidence would remain hidden until someone else discovered it. As he finished concealing the documents, Avery heard voices in the tunnel behind him. His pursuers had followed his trail and would soon discover his location. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide. The conspiracy that had ruled Stoneville for decades was about to claim another victim. But in that moment of apparent defeat, Avery felt a strange sense of peace. He had done everything in his power to ensure that the truth would eventually be revealed. The voices of the victims that had called to him from the hidden chamber would not be silenced forever. Somewhere, hidden in the darkness beneath Stoneville, lay the evidence that would one day bring justice to those who had suffered and died in the name of twisted ideology. The capture and disappearance of Clifton Avery marked the beginning of the most intensive cover-up in Stoneville's dark history. Within hours of his discovery in the basement of Judge Morrison's private residence, a carefully orchestrated campaign began to erase all evidence of his investigation and eliminate any trace of his shocking discoveries. Sheriff Briggs personally supervised the sealing of the courthouse basement's hidden chamber. The false wall was reinforced with steel plates and concrete, making it virtually impossible for future investigators to discover the passage that Avery had found. The documents and artifacts that remained in the chamber were either destroyed or relocated to more secure facilities outside of Stoneville. Dr. Harrison used his medical expertise to ensure that Avery's disappearance would appear to be the result of natural causes. Official records would show that the county clerk had suffered a sudden heart attack while working late in the courthouse, and that his body had been immediately cremated due to concerns about contagious disease. The story was plausible enough to satisfy casual inquiry, while simultaneously eliminating any physical evidence of foul play. Harold Wickham took charge of managing the administrative aspects of the cover-up. All of the files that Avery had been working with were reviewed and sanitized, removing any references to missing documents or unexplained discrepancies. New filing systems were implemented to prevent future clerks from discovering the gaps in the official record that had first aroused Avery's suspicions. Judge Morrison used his influence to control the legal aspects of the situation. Any investigations into Avery's disappearance were quickly closed, and potential witnesses were either bought off or intimidated into silence. The judge's connections throughout the Missouri legal system ensured that no outside authorities would take an interest in the case. The conspiracy's response to Avery's discovery revealed the true scope of their organization and resources. This was not simply a group of local criminals, but a sophisticated network that included members at every level of government and society. Their ability to mobilize such an extensive cover-up operation within hours of the crisis demonstrated both their efficiency and their ruthlessness. The townspeople of Stoneville were told that Clifton Avery had suffered a tragic but not uncommon fate. Heart attacks were a leading cause of death among men of his age, and the stress of his job could easily have contributed to such a medical emergency. The story was accepted without question by most resided tenants who had learned over the years not to ask uncomfortable questions about sudden deaths or unexplained disappearances. But a few individuals were not satisfied with the official explanation. Emma Patterson, the elderly woman who had shared her grandfather's stories with Avery, noticed that his disappearance coincided with unusual activity around the courthouse. She had seen men entering and leaving the building at odd hours, carrying equipment and materials that seemed inconsistent with normal county business. Martha Henderson, the general store owner, also had suspicions about the official story. Avery had been a regular customer, and she had noticed changes in his behavior during the weeks before his disappearance. He had seemed nervous and distracted, frequently glancing over his shoulder as if he feared he was being watched. This was not the behavior of a man suffering from heart disease, but rather of someone who was afraid for his life. These doubts and suspicions were shared in whispered conversations between trusted friends, but never voiced publicly. The fate of those who asked too many questions in Stoneville was well known, and self-preservation dictated silence rather than investigation. The conspiracy's power was so absolute that even private doubts were dangerous to express. The underground network that Avery had discovered was systematically dismantled and relocated. The tunnels connecting the courthouse to other buildings in the town were sealed with concrete, eliminating the infrastructure that had allowed the conspirators to move unseen throughout Stoneville. New facilities were established in more remote locations, where their activities could continue without the risk of accidental discovery. The research program that had claimed so many victims was not abandoned, but rather moved to a more secure location deep in the Ozark wilderness. A compound was constructed in a valley that was accessible only by a single, well-guarded road, and the experiments that had once taken place beneath the courthouse resumed in purpose-built laboratories staffed by recruited experts from around the country. The victims whose belongings Avery had found in the hidden chamber were officially declared to have died of various natural causes or accidents. Death certificates were forged, burial records were created, and their names were added to the official county registry of deaths. In the eyes of the law, these people had lived and died as ordinary citizens, with no indication of the horrific circumstances that had actually ended their lives. The personal effects that had been stored in the chamber were disposed of in various ways. Some were burned, others were buried in unmarked graves, and a few were retained as trophies by the conspirators themselves. The child's doll, the woman's jewelry, the men's pocket watches, all the tangible reminders of the lives that had been destroyed, were scattered to the winds, leaving no trace of the crimes that had been committed. Local newspapers were instructed not to publish any articles about missing persons or unexplained deaths. Editors who had previously covered such stories were either bought off or replaced with more compliant individuals. The press, which should have served as a check on government corruption, became instead a tool for concealing it. The few law enforcement officers who were not part of the conspiracy found themselves reassigned to other duties or encouraged to seek employment elsewhere. Deputy marshals who had shown interest in investigating missing persons reports were transferred to different districts. Federal agents who had begun to notice patterns in the disappearances were given new assignments that took them far from Missouri. The conspiracy's reach extended into religious institutions as well. Ministers who had asked questions about missing parishioners were persuaded to accept explanations about families moving away or individuals leaving to seek opportunities elsewhere. Church records were altered to support these false narratives, and memorial services were held for people who had actually been murdered. Educational institutions were not immune to the conspiracy's influence. Teachers who had noticed that certain students had simply stopped attending school were told that the families had relocated. School records were modified to reflect these fictional transfers, and any documentation that might have contradicted the official stories was destroyed. The medical community was perhaps the most thoroughly compromised of all. Dr. Harrison's involvement meant that death certificates could be falsified, autopsies could be avoided, and medical records could be altered to support whatever narrative the conspiracy required. Other physicians in the area were either recruited into the organization or intimidated into compliance with its requirements. Financial institutions played their part as well. Banks were instructed to close accounts belonging to missing persons and transfer the funds to accounts controlled by the conspiracy. Property deeds were altered to show that victims had sold their holdings before departing the area. Insurance policies were quietly canceled, with beneficiaries being told that the policies had lapsed due to non-payment of premiums. The systematic nature of the cover-up revealed the conspiracy's understanding that successful concealment required attention to every detail. It was not enough simply to eliminate the victims and dispose of their bodies. Every aspect of their existence had to be accounted for and explained in ways that would not arouse suspicion. As months passed following Avery's disappearance, the effectiveness of the cover-up became apparent. Life in Stoneville returned to its normal rhythm, with no indication that anything unusual had ever occurred. The courthouse functioned as it always had. County business proceeded without interruption, and the dark secrets that lay beneath the building's foundation remained safely hidden. But the conspiracy's leaders understood that their security was not absolute. Avery's investigation had revealed vulnerabilities in their system that needed to be addressed. New procedures were implemented to monitor county employees more closely, ensuring that future clerks would not have the access or opportunity to discover what their predecessor had found. Electronic surveillance systems, primitive by modern standards but advanced for 1914, were installed in sensitive areas of the courthouse. Hidden microphones allowed the conspirators to monitor conversations and identify potential threats before they could develop into serious problems. The basement was placed under constant guard, with trusted members of the organization taking shifts to ensure that no unauthorized person could gain access. The recruitment of new members became more selective and systematic. Potential candidates were thoroughly investigated before being approached, and their psychological profiles were carefully analyzed to ensure their suitability for the organization's activities. Only individuals who demonstrated both the necessary skills and the appropriate moral flexibility were invited to join. Training programs were established to educate new members about security procedures and operational protocols. The casual approach that had characterized the conspiracy's early years was replaced by a more professional structure that emphasized discipline and adherence to established procedures. The organization was evolving from a loose association of like-minded individuals into a sophisticated criminal enterprise. The lessons learned from Avery's investigation led to improvements in every aspect of the conspiracy's operations. Victim selection became more careful, with emphasis placed on choosing individuals whose disappearances would attract minimal attention. Disposal methods were refined to eliminate any possibility of discovery, and body storage was moved to more remote locations. Record-keeping was completely overhauled, with all documentation being maintained in code and stored in multiple secure locations. The detailed journals that had provided Avery with so much incriminating evidence were replaced by cryptic notations that would be meaningless to anyone not familiar with the conspiracy's internal language. Communication protocols were established to ensure that information was shared only on a need-to-know basis. Members were assigned specific roles and responsibilities, with limited knowledge of activities outside their immediate areas of concern. This compartmentalization would make it much more difficult for any future investigator to piece together the full scope of the organization's activities. The conspiracy's response to Avery's investigation demonstrated both their adaptability and their determination to continue their operations regardless of external threats. They had learned from their mistakes and emerged stronger and more secure than ever before. The brief exposure of their activities had not weakened them. It had made them more dangerous. As 1914 drew to a close, the conspirators could congratulate themselves on having successfully weathered their most serious crisis. The threat posed by Clifton Avery had been eliminated. The evidence he had gathered had been destroyed or concealed, and their operations could continue with enhanced security measures in place. But hidden in the basement of Judge Morrison's residence, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed behind a loose stone, lay the documents that Avery had concealed in his final desperate act. The evidence that would eventually expose the conspiracy's crimes remained hidden but intact, waiting for someone else to discover the truth that had cost so many lives to uncover. The cover-up was complete, but it was not perfect, and in the years that followed, cracks would begin to appear in the carefully constructed facade that concealed Stoneville's darkest secrets. Years passed like shadows across the Ozark Hills, and the memory of Clifton Avery faded from the daily consciousness of Stoneville's residents. New clerks came to work in the courthouse, new families moved to town, and the rhythms of rural life continued unchanged. But beneath the surface of normalcy, the conspiracy that had claimed so many lives continued its dark work, adapting and evolving with each passing season. The outbreak of the Great War in Europe provided the conspirators with new opportunities and challenges. Young men from Stoneville and the surrounding counties enlisted in the military or were drafted to serve overseas, creating a ready supply of individuals whose disappearances could be easily explained. Families were told that their sons had died heroically in France, or had simply gone missing in the chaos of battle, when in reality they had never left Missouri. Dr. Harrison found that wartime conditions provided excellent cover for his medical experiments. The influenza pandemic that swept across the world in 1918 and 1919 offered numerous opportunities to claim victims while attributing their deaths to disease. The general confusion and fear that accompanied the pandemic made it easy to manipulate death records and dispose of bodies without attracting unwanted attention. Judge Morrison used his influence to ensure that Stoneville received a steady stream of military recruits who were passing through the area on their way to training camps. These young men, far from home and family, made ideal subjects for the conspiracy's research programs. Their disappearances were attributed to desertion, a common enough occurrence during wartime that it said no suspicion. Sheriff Briggs expanded his network of informants and collaborators throughout the region, recruiting individuals who could identify potential victims and monitor the activities of anyone who might pose a threat to the organization. The war created economic hardship that made many people willing to cooperate in exchange for money or protection, and Briggs was skilled at exploiting these vulnerabilities. The conspiracy's operations became increasingly sophisticated during this period. They established connections with similar organizations in other states, sharing information and resources that allowed them to expand their activities beyond the confines of rural Missouri. What had begun as a local criminal enterprise was evolving into something with national scope and ambitions. New facilities were constructed in remote areas of the Ozarks, hidden in valleys and caves that were virtually inaccessible to outsiders. These installations were equipped with the latest scientific equipment and staffed by recruited experts who brought advanced knowledge and techniques to the conspiracy's research programs. The primitive torture chamber beneath the courthouse was replaced by modern laboratories that could conduct experiments with unprecedented precision and efficiency. The organization's membership grew to include academics, physicians, businessmen, and government officials from across the region. Monthly meetings were held at rotating locations, with elaborate security measures to ensure that the gatherings remained secret. New members were inducted through ritualistic ceremonies that emphasized their lifelong commitment to the organization's goals and methods. Record-keeping was completely modernized, with coded filing systems and encrypted communications that made it virtually impossible for outsiders to understand the true nature of the conspiracy's activities. The detailers. Dickey journals that had provided Clifton Avery with such damning evidence were replaced by abstract notations that revealed nothing to casual observers. Public relations became an important concern as the conspiracy grew in size and influence. Members were encouraged to maintain high profiles in their communities, participating in charitable activities and civic organizations that would enhance their reputations and deflect suspicion from their secret activities. Judge Morrison, for example, became known throughout the region as a generous philanthropist who donated substantial sums to churches and schools. The conspiracy also began to influence academic and scientific institutions, providing funding for research projects that aligned with their eugenic philosophy. Universities throughout the Midwest received grants to study human genetics, population control, and social engineering, often without realizing that their benefactors were applying the results of their research in horrific ways. Media manipulation became increasingly important as well. The conspiracy established relationships with newspaper publishers and magazine editors, ensuring that stories about missing persons or unexplained deaths received minimal coverage. When such stories did appear, they were carefully crafted to discourage further investigation and redirect public attention toward more acceptable explanations. But despite their growing sophistication and influence, the conspirators could not completely eliminate all evidence of their activities. Bodies were occasionally discovered by hunters or hikers in remote areas of the Ozarks, though these findings were typically attributed to accidents or natural deaths. Families continued to receive reports that their missing relatives had been seen in distant cities, though these sightings were often fabricated by the conspiracy's agents. More troubling for us, From the organization's perspective were the persistent rumors and folklore that developed around their activities. Stories of strange lights in the forest, of screams echoing from abandoned buildings, of people who simply vanished without explanation, became part of the local oral tradition. While these tales were dismissed by most as superstition, they represented a form of collective memory that preserved knowledge of the conspiracy's crimes. Children grew up hearing whispered stories about the courthouse basement, about rooms that didn't appear on any blueprint, about sounds that came from beneath the ground. These stories were passed down from generation to generation, becoming part of the cultural fabric of the region even as their factual basis was forgotten or obscured. Emma Patterson continued to share her grandfather's stories with anyone willing to listen, though she was careful to present them as folklore rather than fact. She had learned from Clifton Avery's fate that too much curiosity about the courthouse's secrets could be dangerous, but she felt compelled to preserve the memory of what her family had witnessed over the decades. Martha Henderson noticed patterns in the disappearances that occurred in and around Stoneville, though she was careful never to voice her suspicions openly. The general store owner had an encyclopedic knowledge of the town's residents and visitors, and she observed that certain types of people, transients, outsiders, those without strong family connections, were disproportionately likely to vanish without explanation. These women and others like them formed an informal network of observers who kept watch over their community, sharing information through subtle gestures and coded conversations. They could not openly challenge the conspiracy, but they could preserve knowledge and warn others about potential dangers. Their quiet vigilance represented a form of resistance that the conspirators found difficult to counter. Religious leaders also played a role in preserving memory and providing comfort to those who suspected the truth. Ministers who had been intimidated into silence about missing parishioners found ways to honor the memory of the disappeared through prayers and sermons that spoke in general terms about the need for justice and the hope of eventual redemption. The conspiracy's leaders were aware of these undercurrents of suspicion and resistance, but they calculated that the benefits of their activities outweighed the risks posed by local gossip and folklore. As long as no concrete evidence of their crimes surfaced, and as long as no outside authorities took an interest in investigating the rumors, they could continue their operations with relative impunity. However, they also recognized that their security depended on maintaining a careful balance between expansion and concealment. Too much growth would inevitably attract unwanted attention, while too little progress would fail to advance their eugenic objectives. The organization needed to evolve and adapt constantly to maintain its effectiveness while avoiding exposure. This balance became increasingly difficult to maintain as the 1920s progressed. The end of the Great War brought new federal agencies and investigative techniques that posed potential threats to the conspiracy's security. The Bureau of Investigation, predecessor to the FBI, was beginning to take a more active interest in interstate crimes and organized criminal activities. At the same time, improvements in communication and transportation were making it harder to isolate communities like Stoneville from outside scrutiny. Radio broadcasts brought news from across the country. Automobiles made travel easier and more common, and telephone lines connected even remote areas to the broader world. The conspiracy's traditional reliance on isolation and secrecy was becoming less reliable as America became more connected. The organization responded to these challenges by becoming even more sophisticated in its methods and more careful in its selection of targets. They invested heavily in technology and training, ensuring that their operations remained ahead of law enforcement capabilities. They also expanded their influence into federal agencies, recruiting members who could provide early warning of any investigations that might threaten their activities. But even as they adapted to the changing times, the conspirators knew that their greatest vulnerability remained the same as it had always been: the possibility that someone with access to their secrets would choose to expose them, regardless of the personal cost. Clifton Avery had come dangerously close to succeeding in this effort, and his example served as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration for others who might follow in his footsteps. The documents that Avery had hidden in Judge Morrison's basement remained where he had placed them, sealed behind the loose stone and forgotten by all except their dead concealer. These papers contained enough evidence to destroy the conspiracy, but they could only fulfill their purpose if someone discovered them and had the courage to act on what they revealed. As the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, and the Great Depression brought new hardships to the Ozark region, the stage was being set for another confrontation between those who sought to expose the truth and those who were determined to keep it buried. The conspiracy had grown stronger and more sophisticated, but it had also grown larger and more complex, creating new opportunities for its secrets to be revealed. The hidden documents waited in their concealment, patient and silent, ready to serve as the foundation for justice when the right person finally discovered them. The voices of the victims that had called to Clifton Avery from the courthouse basement continued to echo through the years, waiting for someone else to hear their pleas and take up their cause. In the shadows of the Ozark Hills, where morning mist still clung to ancient secrets and evening darkness concealed ongoing crimes, the battle between truth and deception continued. The conspiracy had won many victories over the years, but their ultimate defeat remained as inevitable as the sunrise that would eventually illuminate even the deepest shadows. The Great Depression brought unprecedented hardship to the Missouri Ozarks. But for the conspiracy that had operated in the shadows of Stoneville for decades, economic turmoil created new opportunities. Desperate families were more willing to accept official explanations for missing relatives, especially when those explanations came with small payments to help cover funeral expenses or outstanding debts. The general atmosphere of despair and resignation made it easier than ever to make people disappear without generating uncomfortable questions. Sheriff Briggs, now in his third decade of managing the conspiracy's security operations, had perfected the art of identifying vulnerable targets: migrant workers searching for employment, families who had lost their farms to bank foreclosures, young people leaving home to seek opportunities in distant cities. All provided a steady supply of victims whose disappearances could be attributed to the economic chaos of the times. Dr. Harrison, approaching retirement but still committed to his research, had established connections with medical schools and research institutions throughout the Midwest. Under the guise of studying the effects of malnutrition and disease on human development, he was able to obtain funding and resources that supported the conspiracy's experimental programs. The scientific community's growing interest in genetics and heredity provided perfect cover for activities that would have horrified the researchers who unknowingly supported them. Judge Morrison had become a figure of regional prominence, serving on state committees and advisory boards that gave him influence far beyond the borders of his home county. His reputation as a legal scholar and community leader was unquestioned, and his opinions carried weight in political and academic circles throughout Missouri. The respect he commanded made it virtually impossible for anyone to challenge his authority or question his motives. But by the mid-1930s, the conspiracy was facing new challenges that threatened its continued existence. Federal agencies were becoming more active in investigating interstate crimes, and new communication technologies were making it harder to control the flow of information. The organization that had thrived in isolation was finding it increasingly difficult to maintain its secrecy in a more connected world. The most serious threat came from an unexpected source. Thomas Mitchell, a young journalist from Kansas City, had begun investigating stories of missing persons throughout rural Missouri as part of a series about the human cost of the Depression. His research had led him to notice patterns in the disappearances that seemed to center around certain counties in the Ozark region. Mitchell was not content to accept official explanations or rely on second-hand accounts. He traveled extensively throughout the region, interviewing family members of missing persons and reviewing public records for inconsistencies. His background in accounting, acquired before he turned to journalism, made him particularly skilled at spotting discrepancies in financial records and legal documents. The journalist's investigation had not yet focused specifically on Stoneville, but his methodical approach and attention to detail made it inevitable that he would eventually discover the pattern of disappearances that surrounded the town. The conspiracy's leaders recognized that Mitchell posed a more serious threat than any they had faced since Clifton Avery, because his profession gave him both the skills to uncover their secrets and the platform to expose them to a wide audience. Emergency meetings were held to discuss how to deal with the Mitchell problem. Some members advocated for the direct approach that had worked so well in the past: simply eliminate the threat before it could develop further. But others argued that killing a prominent journalist would attract exactly the kind of attention they had spent decades trying to avoid. Judge Morrison ultimately decided on a more subtle approach. Instead of eliminating Mitchell, they would attempt to discredit him and undermine his investigation through a carefully orchestrated campaign of disinformation and character assassination. The conspiracy's influence in media and academic circles would be used to question Mitchell's methods and conclusions, while their connections in government would ensure that official sources would not cooperate with his research. Dr. Harrison was assigned to create false medical records and death certificates that would provide plausible explanations for some of the disappearances Mitchell was investigating. These documents would be planted in various archives and medical facilities, where the journalist would eventually discover them and conclude that his suspicions were unfounded. Sheriff Briggs was tasked with managing the more direct aspects of the disinformation campaign. His network of informants and collaborators would spread rumors about Mitchell's personal life and professional competence, while carefully crafted evidence would be planted to suggest that the journalist was fabricating stories to advance his career. The campaign against Mitchell began in early 1936 and continued for several months. False documents were planted, witnesses were coached to provide misleading testimony, and a steady stream of rumors and accusations were circulated through professional and social networks. The conspiracy, its members used their positions of authority and respect to subtly undermine Mitchell's credibility without appearing to be coordinating their efforts. Initially, the campaign appeared to be successful. Mitchell's editors at several newspapers began to question his stories, and some of his sources became reluctant to cooperate with his investigation. The journalist found himself spending more time defending his methods than pursuing new leads, and the momentum of his investigation began to slow. But Mitchell was more persistent and resourceful than the conspirators had anticipated. Instead of abandoning his investigation in the face of official resistance, he changed his approach and began focusing on specific cases rather than attempting to document broad patterns. His detailed examination of individual disappearances led him to discover inconsistencies and anomalies that the conspiracy's disinformation campaign could not explain away. The breakthrough came when Mitchell interviewed Martha Henderson, the elderly general store owner who had been quietly observing the patterns of disappearances around Stoneville for decades. Martha had grown tired of maintaining her silence, and the journalist's respectful and patient approach convinced her to share some of the stories she had heard over the years. Martha did not directly accuse anyone of criminal activity, but she provided Mitchell with enough information to focus his investigation on Stoneville and its courthouse. She mentioned the stories about strange sounds from the basement, the unusual number of people who had simply vanished without explanation, and the climate of fear that discouraged questions about these disappearances. Armed with this new information, Mitchell began a systematic examination of public records related to Stoneville County. His accounting background served him well as he analyzed financial documents, property transfers, and legal proceedings for signs of irregularities. What he found convinced him that the town was the center of whatever piracy he had been trying to uncover. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable once Mitchell knew what to look for. Properties belonging to missing persons were consistently transferred to a small group of buyers at below-market prices. Death certificates for alleged victims of accidents or disease were signed by the same physician. Legal proceedings involving missing persons were invariably handled by the same judge. The interconnections were too numerous and too convenient to be coincidental. Mitchell's investigation had reached the point where he was ready to publish his findings, despite the lack of direct evidence of criminal activity. His series of articles would present the circumstantial evidence he had gathered and call for official investigations by state and federal authorities. The conspiracy's carefully constructed facade was about to be exposed to public scrutiny. But the conspirators had not exhausted their resources. Judge Morrison used his political connections to arrange for Mitchell to be arrested on fabricated charges of fraud and embezzlement. The evidence against him was sophisticated and convincing, created by experts who understood how to manipulate financial records and legal documents. The journalist found himself fighting for his freedom and reputation instead of pursuing his investigation. The arrest and subsequent legal proceedings served the conspiracy's purposes perfectly. Mitchell's credibility was destroyed, his investigation was discredited, and his findings were dismissed as the desperate fabrications of a criminal trying to deflect attention from his own crimes. The media attention that might have exposed the conspiracy instead focused on the fallen journalist's alleged misdeeds. Mitchell was eventually convicted and sentenced to several years in prison, where he died under suspicious circumstances before completing his term. His death was attributed to suicide, though some who knew him found it difficult to believe that he would have taken his own life. The investigation that had threatened to expose decades of crimes was buried along with its author. The successful elimination of the Mitchell threat demonstrated the conspiracy's continued ability to protect itself against external challenges. But it also revealed the extent to which they had been forced to expose themselves in order to maintain their security. The campaign against the journalist had required the cooperation of numerous officials and the creation of extensive false documentation, creating new vulnerabilities that could be exploited by future investigators. More importantly, the conspiracy's victory came at a cost that would have long-term consequences. The elaborate cover-up had required the involvement of federal agencies and officials who had not previously been part of the organization. These new collaborators represented both assets and liabilities, expanding the conspiracy's reach, while also increasing the number of people who possessed dangerous knowledge. The network of corruption that had once been centered in a single county now extended across state lines and into federal agencies. This expansion made the conspiracy more powerful, but also more vulnerable to exposure if any of its members chose to break their silence. The organization that had survived by maintaining strict security and limited membership was becoming exactly the kind of sprawling criminal enterprise that federal investigators were most capable of detecting and prosecuting. As the 1930s drew to a close, the conspiracy's leaders recognized that they were facing a crossroads. They could continue to expand their operations and influence, accepting the increased risks that came with growth, or they could scale back their activities and focus on maintaining their existing power base. The decision they made would determine not only their own fate, but the fate of the countless victims whose voices continue to cry out for justice from unmarked graves throughout the Missouri Ozarks. Hidden in the basement of Judge Morrison's residence, the documents that Clifton Avery had concealed more than 2 decades earlier remained undisturbed. The evidence they contained was as damning as ever, waiting for someone with the courage and resources to discover them and act on what they revealed. The conspiracy had grown more sophisticated and more powerful, but their ultimate vulnerability remained unchanged. The truth of their crimes, preserved in meticulous detail by their own hands, ready to destroy them if it ever came to light. As America moved closer to involvement in another world war, the stage was being set for yet another confrontation between those who sought to hide the truth and those who were determined to reveal it. The conspiracy had won many battles over the years, but the war for justice was far from over. In the shadows of the Ozark Hills, where ancient secrets lay buried beneath layers of official lies and public indifference, the voice of truth continued to whisper, waiting for someone with the courage to listen and the strength to act. The arrival of the 1940s brought global conflict and dramatic changes to American society. But in the hidden corners of the Missouri Ozarks, the conspiracy that had flourished for decades continued its dark work with renewed vigor. World War II provided unprecedented opportunities for the organization's activities, as the chaos and disruption of wartime made it easier than ever to make people disappear without generating unwanted attention. Military conscription created a perfect cover for eliminating potential threats and acquiring new subjects for research. Young men who might have asked uncomfortable questions about missing neighbors or suspicious activities were sent overseas to fight, while those who remained behind were more focused on supporting the war effort than investigating local mysteries. The conspiracy's members used their positions of authority to influence draft boards and military recruiters, ensuring that inconvenient individuals were either sent to distant battlefields or classified as missing in action. Dr. Harrison, now in his 70s but still actively involved in the organization's research programs, found that wartime medical protocols provided excellent cover for his experiments. The government's urgent need for medical advances to treat wounded soldiers created a climate in which almost any research could be justified as contributing to the war effort. Federal funding flowed freely to projects that promised to advance military medicine, and few questions were asked about methodology or ethical considerations. The doctor had established connections with military medical facilities and research institutions throughout the country, creating a network that allowed him to share information and resources with like-minded researchers. The conspiracy's activities were no longer limited to a single location, but had become part of a broader movement that included participants from across the scientific and medical communities. Judge Morrison, now approaching his 40th year on the bench, had become one of the most respected legal figures in Missouri. His opinions were regularly cited by appellate courts, and his expertise in constitutional law had made him a sought-after consultant for federal agencies dealing with wartime legal issues. The judge's reputation for integrity and wisdom was unquestioned, making it virtually impossible for anyone to challenge his authority or suspect his involvement in CRI, minor activities. Sheriff Briggs had been succeeded by his hand-picked deputy, William Crawford, who continued the tradition of protecting the conspiracy's interests while maintaining the appearance of legitimate law enforcement. Crawford was younger and more sophisticated than his predecessor, with connections to federal law enforcement agencies that enhanced the organization's security and intelligence capabilities. But despite their continued success in avoiding detection, the conspiracy's leaders were beginning to face challenges that threatened their long-term survival. The federal government's expanding role in law enforcement was creating new oversight mechanisms that made it harder to conceal criminal activities. The FBI was becoming more sophisticated in its investigative techniques and more aggressive in pursuing interstate crimes. More troubling from the organization's perspective was the growing number of people who possessed knowledge of their activities. The network that had once included only a handful of trusted individuals now encompassed dozens of members and hundreds of collaborators. Each new person brought into the conspiracy represented both an asset and a potential security risk, and managing these relationships was becoming increasingly complex and dangerous. The most serious threat came from an unexpected direction. Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, Emma Patterson's nephew, who had enlisted in the Army Corps of Engineers, had returned from the European theater with new skills and perspectives that made him uniquely qualified to investigate the mysteries that had plagued his hometown for decades. His military experience had taught him to recognize patterns and anomalies that civilian investigators might miss, while his family connections gave him access to local knowledge and folklore that outsiders could not obtain. Patterson had grown up here, hearing his aunt's stories about the courthouse basement and the strange disappearances that seemed to center around Stoneville.
The stories he told were different from the approved versions, wilder, sadder, shot through with a kind of desperate hope that refused to be extinguished even after 2 centuries of systematic suppression. In his telling, Frodo was not a madman but a hero. The quest was not impossible but merely interrupted, and somewhere beyond the borders of the known world, the light still burned in hearts that had never learned to surrender. "They tell us the age of war is over," Tolman would whisper to his small audience as the autumn wind rattled the shutters of their hidden meeting place. "They tell us that peace has come at last, that all the old struggles have been resolved. But I ask you, what kind of peace is it that requires the death of every dream? What kind of order is it that can only exist when no one dares to ask what lies beyond the hills?" The hobbits who heard these words would nod and murmur their agreement, but they were careful never to speak of such things in the light of day. The consequences of open dissent were not death or imprisonment. Such crude methods had been abandoned long ago. Instead, those who showed signs of social maladjustment were taken to special facilities where they received therapy designed to help them achieve better harmony with their environment. Most who underwent such treatment emerged as model citizens, grateful for the opportunity to contribute more effectively to the common good. They never spoke of what they had experienced, but their eyes held a peculiar emptiness that made their families shudder and look away. Yet even in this world of perfect order and absolute control, there remained pockets of resistance that no amount of therapy could quite eliminate. Deep in the foundations of the old dwarf cities, where the hammers had once rung on anvils and the forges had blazed with eager fire, small groups of craftsmen still gathered to create works that served no practical purpose but their own beauty. Their art was illegal, of course. Individual expression was seen as a form of spiritual selfishness that detracted from collective harmony. But they persisted nonetheless, driven by something in their dwarven nature that refused to be entirely domesticated. In the ruins of the ancient elven realms, where the golden trees had once sung in the wind and the waters had sparkled with captured starlight, rangers still walked paths that existed more in memory than in physical reality. These were not the rangers of old, who had served the kings of men and guarded the borders of civilization. Instead, they were wanderers who served no master but their own need to remember what the world had been before it was perfected. Their very existence was a kind of prayer, a wordless plea to whatever powers might still listen, that not all the beauty of the elder days would be forgotten. But perhaps the strangest of all the hidden communities were the scholars who met in secret to study what they called the lost arts, magic, prophecy, the reading of signs and portents that might hint at possibilities beyond the carefully controlled present. These learned men and women pored over fragments of ancient texts, searching for clues that might suggest their ordered world was not as permanent as it appeared. They spoke in whispers of the music of creation, of themes and variations that had not yet been fully explored, of discord that might yet be transformed into a higher harmony. From beneath the roots of the party tree, where the soil still held the faintest echo of hobbit laughter, and the grass remembered what it felt like to dance in an uncontrolled breeze, a small voice whispered the words that had become both prayer and promise. There and back again, someday. It was a voice that belonged to no living throat, a sound that might have been the wind in the leaves or the settling of old timber.
The judge argued that a military officer with Patterson's skills and connections would be a valuable asset, and that his family ties to the community made him a natural candidate for membership. Dr. Harrison disagreed, pointing out that Patterson's investigation had already progressed too far for recruitment to be feasible. The lieutenant colonel had clearly identified the conspiracy as a criminal organization, and his moral principles would never allow him to join their cause. The doctor argued for immediate elimination, regardless of the risks involved. Sheriff Crawford proposed a middle course that would neutralize Patterson without creating a martyr. The sheriff's plan involved framing the lieutenant colonel for various crimes, destroying his credibility and reputation while simultaneously discrediting his investigation. Military personnel who fell from grace were often forgotten quickly, and their accusations were rarely taken seriously by civilian authorities. The conspiracy ultimately decided to implement Crawford's plan, but they also prepared contingency measures in case the frame-up failed to neutralize Patterson effectively. Additional security measures were put in place around sensitive facilities, and emergency protocols were activated to protect key members and assets if the organization's existence was exposed. The campaign against Patterson began in late 1946 and continued through the following year. False evidence was planted suggesting that the lieutenant colonel had been involved in black market activities and corruption during his military service. Anonymous accusations were made to military investigators, claiming that Patterson had stolen equipment and supplies for personal profit. His security clearance was suspended pending investigation, and his access to military resources was restricted. The conspiracy's efforts were initially successful in undermining Patterson's position and credibility. Military investigators took the accusations seriously, and the lieutenant colonel found himself fighting court-martial proceedings instead of pursuing his investigation of the Stoneville conspiracy. His evidence was confiscated as part of the military inquiry, and he was forbidden from discussing his findings while the proceedings were ongoing. But Patterson had anticipated this possibility and had taken precautions to protect his investigation. The materials that were confiscated by military investigators were only copies, while the originals had been securely hidden along with detailed instructions for their use. If Patterson was eliminated or discredited, his evidence would eventually find its way to people who could act on it. The lieutenant colonel's preparations proved prescient when he died in what appeared to be an automobile accident while traveling to testify at his court-martial. The crash occurred on a remote stretch of highway in conditions that made mechanical failure seem plausible. But those who knew Patterson found it difficult to believe that such an experienced driver would lose control under those circumstances. Patterson's death effectively ended the military investigation into his alleged crimes, and his accusations against the Stoneville conspiracy were dismissed as the fantasies of a disturbed individual seeking to deflect attention from his own misconduct. The evidence he had gathered was classified and buried in military archives, where it would remain hidden for decades. But the conspiracy's victory was not as complete as they believed. Patterson's careful preparations had ensured that his evidence would survive his death, hidden in locations that were known only to a few trusted individuals. The documents and photographs he had compiled would eventually resurface, providing future investigators with the proof they needed to expose the conspiracy's crimes. More importantly, Patterson's investigation had revealed the conspiracy's continued vulnerability to determined and skilled investigators. Despite their growing power and sophistication, they remained dependent on secrecy and intimidation to protect their activities. When confronted by someone who possessed both the knowledge and the courage to challenge them, they were forced to resort to crude tactics that exposed them to additional risks. As the 1940s came to an end, the conspiracy found itself in a stronger position than ever before, with extensive networks of influence and resources that seemed to guarantee their continued security. But they also faced new challenges that would test their ability to adapt and survive in a rapidly changing world. The seeds of their eventual downfall had been planted by investigators like Clifton Avery, Thomas Mitchell, and James Patterson, and those seeds would eventually grow into the forces that would bring justice to the victims who had suffered in silence for so many decades. In the hidden chambers beneath Stoneville, in the sealed documents that lay waiting to be discovered, in the unmarked graves that dotted the Missouri countryside, the evidence of the conspiracy's crimes continued to accumulate. No amount of power or influence could ultimately erase the truth of what had been done, and that truth would eventually demand its due, regardless of how long the wait might be. The forces of justice moved slowly but inevitably, gathering strength with each passing year and each new revelation. The conspiracy had won many battles in their war against exposure, but the final victory would belong to those who fought for truth and justice, no matter how high the personal cost might be. The dawn of the 1950s brought an era of prosperity and optimism to America. But in the shadowed valleys of the Missouri Ozarks, the conspiracy that had thrived for decades began to show signs of strain. The organization that had once operated with impunity was finding it increasingly difficult to maintain its security in a world where communication was faster, travel was easier, and federal oversight was more comprehensive than ever before. The conspiracy's membership had grown to include hundreds of individuals across multiple states, creating a network of influence that reached into every level of government, business, and society. But this expansion also created new vulnerabilities, as the organization struggled to maintain discipline and security across such a large and diverse group. The intimate bonds of trust and shared purpose that had characterized the early years were being replaced by more formal structures and procedures that could not entirely eliminate the risk of betrayal or exposure. Dr. Harrison, now in his 80s and approaching the end of his long career, had become increasingly concerned about the organization's future. The medical research that had provided justification for so many of their activities was becoming more sophisticated and more closely regulated, making it harder to conceal unethical experiments among legitimate scientific work. Federal agencies were beginning to take a more active interest in medical research ethics, and the casual approach to human experimentation that had characterized earlier decades was no longer acceptable. Judge Morrison, despite his advanced age, remained the conspiracy's most influential leader, but even his position was not entirely secure. Younger judges and lawyers were beginning to question some of the precedents and practices that Morrison had established over his long career. Federal oversight of local courts was increasing, and the absolute authority that county judges had once wielded was being challenged by appellate decisions and constitutional requirements. Sheriff Crawford had proven to be an effective successor to Briggs, but he faced challenges that his predecessor had never encountered. The FBI was becoming more aggressive in investigating interstate crimes, and the Bureau's sophisticated forensic techniques were making it harder to conceal evidence of criminal activity. Local law enforcement agencies were being required to meet higher standards of professionalism and accountability, and the casual corruption that had once been common was becoming more risky and difficult to maintain. The conspiracy's research facilities had been modernized and expanded, but they also represented an increasing security risk. The remote installations in the Ozark wilderness required large numbers of staff and regular deliveries of supplies and equipment, creating opportunities for outside observation and infiltration. The organization's attempts to maintain secrecy were becoming more complex and expensive, requiring constant vigilance and sophisticated counterintelligence measures. Public attitudes toward authority and government were also changing in ways that threatened the conspiracy's security. The experiences of World War II had taught Americans to be more skeptical of official explanations and more willing to question the actions of their leaders. The civil rights movement was beginning to challenge traditional power structures, and investigative journalism was becoming more aggressive in exposing corruption and abuse. It was against this backdrop of increasing risk and changing circumstances that the conspiracy faced its most serious challenge yet. In 1952, a young FBI agent named David Chen was assigned to investigate a series of missing persons cases that appeared to be connected to organized crime activities in the Midwest. Chen was a second-generation Chinese American who had joined the Bureau after serving as a military intelligence officer during the war, and his background had given him unique insights into the methods used by secretive organizations to maintain security and avoid detection. Chen's investigation began with routine inquiries into the disappearances of several individuals who were believed to have been victims of organized crime, but his methodical approach and attention to detail soon revealed patterns that suggested something far more complex and extensive than typical criminal activity. The missing persons cases spanned several decades and multiple states, but they all seemed to be connected to certain geographic areas and institutions in the Missouri Ozarks. The FBI agent's investigation was facilitated by new technologies and resources that previous investigators had not possessed. He had access to comprehensive federal databases that allowed him to cross-reference information from multiple agencies and jurisdictions. He could communicate rapidly with colleagues across the country, sharing information and coordinating activities in ways that would have been impossible just a few years earlier. Chen's military intelligence background had taught him to recognize the signs of sophisticated cover-up operations, and he quickly identified the conspiracy's methods for concealing their activities. The false documentation, the coordinated disinformation campaigns, the systematic elimination of witnesses. All of these techniques were familiar to him from his wartime experience with enemy intelligence operations. The agent's investigation was also aided by information that had been preserved by previous investigators who had died or disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The military archives contained classified materials from James Patterson's investigation, while local records included fragments of Thomas Mitchell's research that had survived the journalist's discrediting and death. Even Clifton Avery's discoveries had left traces in county records that a skilled investigator could detect and annihilate. Chen approached his investigation with the patience and thoroughness that had made him successful in military intelligence work. He understood that the conspiracy he was pursuing had survived for decades by eliminating direct threats, so he was careful to maintain a low profile and avoid actions that might trigger a violent response. Instead of confronting suspected conspirators directly, he focused on gathering evidence and building a comprehensive case that could not be suppressed or discredited. The FBI agent's investigation was also supported by changes in federal law enforcement that gave him resources and authority that previous investigators had lacked. The Bureau's jurisdiction in interstate crimes had been expanded, and new laws made it easier to pursue organized criminal activities that crossed state lines. The conspiracy's attempts to use local influence to suppress investigations were less effective against federal agents who answered to authorities in Washington rather than local officials. Chen's breakthrough came when he discovered the connection between several missing persons cases and a network of medical research facilities that were receiving federal funding. His analysis of financial records revealed suspicious patterns in the way research grants were being awarded and used. while his examination of medical records showed anomalies that suggested systematic falsification of documentation. The agent's military background had taught him the importance of physical evidence in building criminal cases, and he began to focus on locating the facilities where the conspiracy's activities were taking place. His investigation of property records and construction permits revealed a pattern of building activities in remote areas of the Ozarks that corresponded to the locations where missing persons had last been seen. Chen's field investigations confirmed the existence of sophisticated underground facilities that were not reflected in any public records. Using military surplus equipment and techniques, he conducted covert surveys that revealed the extent of the conspiracy's infrastructure. The network of tunnels, laboratories, and storage facilities that he discovered represented decades of construction and investment that could only have been possible with extensive resources and official protection. The evidence that Chen accumulated was overwhelming and irrefutable. His investigation had documented systematic criminal activity spanning multiple decades and involving hundreds of victims. The conspiracy's membership included officials at every level of government, from local sheriffs to federal agency directors. The scope of the organization's activities extended far beyond the Missouri Ozarks to include facilities and operations in multiple states. But Chen also understood that his evidence would be meaningless if the conspiracy succeeded in eliminating him before he could present his findings to appropriate authorities. The fate of previous investigators served as a warning that the organization would not hesitate to kill anyone who threatened their security, regardless of their position or connections. The FBI agent's solution was to follow the example set by James Patterson and create a comprehensive documentation system that would ensure the survival of his investigation even if he did not. Chen prepared detailed reports that were distributed to multiple locations and individuals, ensuring that his evidence could not be suppressed by eliminating a single person or raiding a single location. Chen also established contact with other federal agents and officials who were conducting related investigations, creating a network of investigators who could support and protect each other. The conspiracy's traditional methods of intimidation and elimination were less effective against a coordinated federal investigation that involved multiple agencies and jurisdictions. The agent's precautions proved necessary when the conspiracy's security apparatus detected his investigation and began planning countermeasures. Emergency meetings were held to discuss how to deal with the federal threat, and various options were considered for neutralizing Chen before his investigation could proceed further. The conspiracy's leaders recognized that they were facing a more serious challenge than any they had encountered before. Chen possessed resources and support that previous investigators had lacked, and his federal authority made it difficult to use the local influence that had been so effective in past cases. The organization would need to adapt its methods and possibly make significant sacrifices to protect its core interests. Judge Morrison, now approaching 90 but still mentally sharp, argued for a strategic withdrawal that would preserve the conspiracy's most important assets while sacrificing less essential operations. The judge recognized that the organization's expanded size and scope had made it vulnerable to exactly the kind of investigation that Chen was conducting, and he believed that survival required a return to the more limited and secure operations of earlier decades. Dr. Harrison, despite his advanced age, advocated for a more aggressive response that would eliminate the federal threat before it could develop further. The doctor argued that the conspiracy had too much invested in their current operations to abandon them without a fight, and that a successful elimination of Chen would discourage other federal investigators from pursuing similar inquiries. Sheriff Crawford supported Morrison's strategic approach, pointing out that the conspiracy's traditional methods were unlikely to be effective against a federal investigation backed by sophisticated resources and multiple agencies. The sheriff argued that the organization needed to adapt to changing circumstances rather than rely on tactics that had worked in a different era. The debate among the conspiracy's leaders, reflected the fundamental changes that were transforming American society in the 1950s. The isolation and local autonomy that had protected the organization for decades were giving way to federal oversight and national coordination that made their traditional methods obsolete. The conspiracy would need to evolve or perish, and the choices they made in response to Chen's investigation would determine their fate. As 1952 drew to a close, the stage was set for the final confrontation between the forces of secrecy and exposure that had been building for nearly 4 decades. The conspiracy had grown powerful and sophisticated, but they had also become vulnerable to the very forces of modernization and federal authority that they had tried to co-opt and control. Chen's investigation continued to gather momentum, supported by federal resources and protected by official authority that the conspiracy could not easily neutralize. The evidence he had accumulated would soon reach decision-makers who possessed the power and determination to act on it, regardless of the political and social costs involved. In the hidden chambers beneath Stoneville, in the sealed documents that had waited decades for discovery, in the unmarked graves that dotted the Missouri landscape, the evidence of the conspiracy's crimes continued to cry out for justice. The voices of the victims that had haunted Clifton Avery in the courthouse basement were about to be heard by those who possessed the power to answer their pleas for justice and ensure that their deaths would not remain unavenged. The final chapter in the conspiracy's long history was about to begin, and the outcome would determine whether justice would finally triumph over the forces of corruption and evil that had held sway in the Missouri Ozarks for so many terrible years. The winter of 1953 brought unseasonably heavy snows to the Missouri Ozarks, blanketing the region in a crystalline silence that seemed to muffle even the whispers of the past. But beneath the pristine white surface, forces were stirring that would soon shatter the conspiracy's carefully maintained facade and expose the horrors that had been hidden for nearly 4 decades. FBI agent David Chen had spent months building his case with the methodical precision of a master craftsman. His investigation had expanded far beyond the original missing persons cases to encompass a comprehensive analysis of the conspiracy's structure, methods, and membership. The evidence he had assembled filled dozens of filing cabinets and included thousands of documents, photographs, and witness statements that painted a picture of systematic criminal activity on an unprecedented scale. Chen's investigation had been aided by a breakthrough that came from an unexpected source. While reviewing classified military files related to James Patterson's court-martial, he had discovered references to hidden evidence that the lieutenant colonel had concealed before his death. Following these clues, Chen had located several caches of documents and photographs that Patterson had hidden in secure locations throughout the region. The materials that Patterson had preserved provided crucial corroboration for Chen's own findings and filled in gaps that would have taken years to reconstruct through independent investigation. The lieutenant colonel's technical analysis of the conspiracy's underground facilities was particularly valuable, providing detailed blueprints and specifications that would guide federal agents to the locations where evidence could be found. But the most significant discovery came when Chen located the cache of documents that Clifton Avery had hidden in Judge Morrison's basement nearly 4 decades earlier. Acting on information contained in Patterson's files, the FBI agent had obtained a search warrant for the judge's residence and conducted a thorough examination of the property. The documents that Avery had wrapped in oilcloth and sealed behind a loose stone were perfectly preserved, their contents as damning as they had been on the day the county clerk had discovered them in the courthouse basement. The journals, maps, and personal effects that Avery had risked his life to preserve provided direct evidence of the conspiracy's earliest crimes and established a clear pattern of activity that had continued for decades. Chen's discovery of Avery's evidence was the final piece of the puzzle that had consumed nearly 2 years of his life. The FBI agent now possessed proof of criminal activity dating back to the 1870s, with clear documentation of the conspiracy's evolution from a local criminal organization to a sophisticated network that spanned multiple states and reached into the highest levels of government. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable, but Chen knew that presenting it would require careful coordination and timing. The conspiracy's membership included federal officials who might be able to suppress or destroy evidence if they received advance warning of the impending investigation. The agent had to ensure that his case was presented simultaneously to multiple authorities, making it impossible for the conspirators to prevent exposure through their traditional methods of intimidation and elimination. Chen coordinated his presentation with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, Attorney General Herbert Brownell, and President Dwight Eisenhower himself. The evidence was presented in a series of classified briefings that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy's activities and the extent of their infiltration into government agencies. The reaction of these officials was one of shock and outrage, followed by a determination to bring the perpetrators to justice, regardless of their positions or connections. The federal response was swift and comprehensive. On March 15, 1953, simultaneous raids were conducted at dozens of locations throughout the Midwest, targeting the conspiracy's facilities, members, and assets. The raids were coordinated by FBI agents working with military personnel who possessed the specialized equipment and expertise needed to access the underground installations that the conspiracy had built over the decades. The raids uncovered evidence that exceeded even Chen's most pessimistic expectations. The underground facilities contained not only laboratories and torture chambers, but also extensive archives that documented every aspect of the conspiracy's activities. The clinical records that Dr. Harrison and his colleagues had maintained provided detailed accounts of thousands of experiments conducted on unwilling subjects over the course of more than 70 years. The personal effects of victims that were found in the facilities represented a catalog of human suffering that defied comprehension. Each item, a child's toy, a woman's wedding ring, a man's pocket watch, represented a life that had been snuffed out in the name of twisted science and eugenic ideology. The sheer volume of these artifacts testified to the industrial scale on which the conspiracy had conducted their crimes. The arrests that followed the raids were equally comprehensive. Judge Morrison, despite his advanced age and failing health, was taken into custody along with dozens of other conspirators who had believed themselves untouchable. Dr. Harrison, Sheriff Crawford, and scores of other officials found themselves facing federal charges that carried the possibility of execution for their roles in what was quickly recognized as one of the most extensive criminal conspiracies in American history. The public reaction to the revelations was one of shock, horror, and disbelief. The idea that such systematic atrocities could have been conducted for decades in the heart of America challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of democratic society and the reliability of official institutions. The conspiracy's membership included individuals who had been respected pillars of their communities, honored for their service, and trusted with the welfare of their fellow citizens. Media coverage of the case was extensive and detailed, with journalists from across the country descending on Missouri to report on the investigation and trials that followed. The evidence that was presented in court proceedings provided the public with a comprehensive view of the conspiracy's activities, from the earliest murders in the 1870s to the sophisticated operations that had been uncovered by the federal raids. The trials that began in the fall of 1953 were among the most significant criminal proceedings in American legal history. The defendants included dozens of individuals who had held positions of authority and respect, accused of crimes that seemed almost incomprehensible in their scope and brutality. The evidence presented by federal prosecutors painted a picture of systematic evil that had operated under the cover of legitimate government and scientific research. Judge Morrison, despite his age and deteriorating health, remained defiant throughout his trial. The elderly jurist maintained that his actions had been motivated by scientific inquiry and social improvement, arguing that the deaths of a few hundred individuals were justified by the knowledge that had been gained through their sacrifice. His testimony revealed the depth of the ideological corruption that had allowed the conspiracy to rationalize their crimes for so many decades. Dr. Harrison took a different approach, claiming that he had been following orders from superiors and that his role had been limited to providing medical expertise for research projects whose true nature he had not understood. The doctor's defense was undermined by the extensive documentation of his personal involvement in planning and conducting experiments, including his own journal entries that revealed his enthusiasm for the work and his pride in its scientific value. Sheriff Crawford attempted to portray himself as a minor player who had been coerced into cooperation by more powerful conspirators. His defense argued that local law enforcement had been systematically corrupted by federal officials and academic researchers who had used their authority to force compliance with illegal activities. This defense was contradicted by evidence showing Crawford's active participation in planning and executing many of the conspiracy's operations. The trials revealed not only the scope of the conspiracy's crimes, but also the extent of their infiltration into American institutions. Evidence presented in court showed that the organization had placed members in federal agencies, academic institutions, medical organizations, and political parties. The conspiracy's influence had reached into areas of American life that the public had assumed were beyond the reach of criminal corruption. The convictions that followed were comprehensive and severe. Judge Morrison was sentenced to death, though he died in prison of natural causes before the sentence could be carried out. Dr. Harrison received a life sentence without possibility of parole, as did Sheriff Crawford and dozens of other conspirators. The few defendants who were convicted of lesser charges received sentences ranging from 20 to 50 years in federal prison. The investigation and trials had lasting effects that extended far beyond the punishment of individual criminals. The revelations about the conspiracy's activities led to comprehensive reforms in federal oversight of local government, medical research ethics, and law enforcement procedure. New safeguards were implemented to prevent the kind of systematic corruption that had allowed the conspiracy to operate with impunity for so many decades. The victims of the conspiracy were finally given the recognition and respect that had been denied them for so long. Memorial services were held throughout the region to honor the memory of those who had died, and efforts were made to identify remains and return them to surviving family members. A monument was erected in Stoneville's town square listing the names of all known victims, ensuring that their sacrifice would not be forgotten by future generations. The courthouse basement where Clifton Avery had first discovered the conspiracy's secrets was converted into a memorial museum that documented the full history of the crimes that had been committed. The hidden chamber that had once held the evidence of systematic murder was preserved as a reminder of the importance of individual courage in confronting institutional evil. Emma Patterson, now in her 90s but still mentally sharp, lived to see justice finally served for the crimes that had haunted her family for generations. She provided crucial testimony during the trials, sharing the stories that had been passed down through her family and explaining how local residents had maintained their knowledge of the conspiracy despite official efforts to suppress it. The investigation also led to the discovery of facilities and victims in other states, revealing that the Missouri conspiracy had been part of a broader network of criminal organizations that had operated throughout the country. Additional investigations were launched in several states, leading to more arrests and convictions that further exposed the extent of the criminal network. But perhaps the most important outcome of the investigation was the validation it provided for the courage and sacrifice of individuals like Clifton Avery, Thomas Mitchell, and James Patterson, who had risked and ultimately lost their lives in the pursuit of truth and justice. Their evidence, preserved through decades of concealment and suppression, had finally served its intended purpose of exposing the conspiracy and bringing its members to justice. The story of the Stoneville conspiracy became a cautionary tale that was studied in law enforcement academies, journalism schools, and government training programs throughout the country. It served as a reminder of the importance of vigilance in protecting democratic institutions and the need for ordinary citizens to speak out against corruption and abuse, regardless of the personal cost. As the 1950s progressed and the immediate aftermath of the trials began to fade from public attention, the people of Stoneville began the long process of rebuilding their community's reputation and identity. The town that had been synonymous with corruption and murder gradually became known instead for its courage in confronting its past and its commitment to ensuring that such horrors would never be repeated. The voices that had whispered from the courthouse basement for so many years were finally silent, their pleas for justice answered by the patient work of investigators who refused to accept official explanations or abandon their search for truth. The conspiracy that had seemed invincible for decades had been brought down by the same force that had created it, the preservation of written records that documented its crimes in meticulous detail. In the hills and valleys of the Missouri Ozarks, where morning mist still clings to ancient stones, and evening shadows still conceal forgotten secrets, the story of the Stoneville conspiracy serves as a reminder that truth, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually find its way to the surface. The light of justice may be slow to arrive, but it shines with a brightness that no amount of darkness can extinguish. The legacy of those who died in the hidden chambers beneath the courthouse lives on in the reforms that were implemented, the safeguards that were established, and the commitment to vigilance that their sacrifice inspired. Their voices, no longer crying out from the darkness for justice, now speak through the laws and institutions that were created to prevent others from suffering the same fate. And in the quiet moments, when the wind moves through the Ozark Hills, some say you can still hear an echo of those voices, not pleading for justice now, but offering thanks to those who finally listened and acted on their pleas. The macabre secret hidden in the county courthouse basement had been revealed at last, and with its exposure came the promise that such secrets would find it much harder to remain hidden in the future. The truth had triumphed, as it always does eventually, and the darkness that had covered Stoneville for so many terrible years had finally given way to the light of justice and the hope of redemption. This story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.